Welcome to part two of our discussion of inflation. Uh, this lesson and this part of, I guess in part two, we'll be discussing a couple more miscellaneous topics with inflation and then move into the CPI. And the CPI is the Consumer Price Index. It's one of the main ways we measure inflation. We'll discuss many different topics with the CPI. So we begin though, as I said, a couple more miscellaneous topics within the discussion of inflation. The first is the discussion of something that's called core inflation. If you read the news, sometimes you'll hear about inflation, and often they'll say the inflation rate was whatever, 4%, but if you exclude food and energy prices, it was only 2%. And, naturally, somebody who doesn't know why they do that could say, well, why would we exclude food and energy prices? The question, of course, depends what you want to measure, but excluding the volatile items like food and energy gives you what's called core inflation, or the core inflation rate. So it's a measure of inflation that excludes some items that face volatile food price movements. Food and energy prices change wildly. So why would that matter? Well, it would matter for policymakers. So policymakers often want to kind of keep inflation low. Really, it's one of the dual mandates of the Federal Reserve is to low inflation and low unemployment. Really, they have two things they want to accomplish. So if they put in energy and food prices, you could see inflation's going to be all over the place. Energy prices change wildly, and it's nothing really to do with government policy at all. Energy prices, demand and supply. If OPEC decides to pull back on production, then oil prices can rise and gasoline prices can rise. Government policy isn't really going to counteract that very well. I mean, there's just not much they can do about that. So the core level is really kind of the overall items that aren't volatile. Want to know what will happen with it. And if we look at percentage change from the year earlier, we see it's kind of a general downward slide. So if there are volatile spikes in your inflation rate year in and year out, it's going to be much more difficult to forecast. So that's why you'd focus on core inflation. It's useful for policymakers or anybody else who wants to predict future inflation. If you want to determine how much worse off am I because of the inflation rate, or how much worse off is somebody because of the inflation rate, core inflation isn't what you want. You want the normal inflation rate. But there'll be some years where it's 5 or 6%, and other years where it could be negative. Both of those have happened in the past 10 years, often because energy and food prices move, they're much more volatile. Another issue with the inflation rate, curing inflation can be painful. As we're going to learn later, there is thought to be a short-run trade-off between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Part of the reasons, this is why expectations for what a future inflation might be, also wage contracts might be built in, expecting a high level of inflation, and if there's a low level, well then firms expected price increases to help pay these higher wages, but they're not getting them. Well, the firm's not making as much money, they likely have to cut some of their workforce. So, lower inflation, higher unemployment rate. There's a short-run trade-off, not a long-run trade-off between these two. And we really saw some evidence of that. In the 1970s, there were high inflation rates, often 10% or much, much higher than today. 5 to 10% inflation rates were the norm in the 70s. So it's nothing like the hyperinflation we discussed, but prices were rising pretty dramatically overall. What in the early 80s, both the Federal Reserve and President Reagan wanted to cut inflation. In fact, some bumper sticker or political buttons, bumper stickers in the 70s, there was an acronym WIN, and I don't know if it was Reagan. Part of me thinks it was Gerald Ford who might have had this. But it said whip inflation now. WIN was the acronym for that. It was a big deal. So in the early 80s, the Federal Reserve went on contracting the money supply in order to cut inflation. And that caused a severe recession. The unemployment rate actually in the 81-82 recession was higher than what it was in this one, in the Great Recession in the past few years. It spiked to almost 11%. I think 10.9 is maybe where it spiked. It was in the high tens. So it was very severe. It did work. The unemployment rate dropped pretty dramatically after that. It was a severe but a very quick recession. And really, we haven't had inflation in this country since. Not of any significant amount. It's always been quite low ever since this recession, which was caused by contracting the money supply to curb the expectations of inflation. But for that short time period, it was pretty painful. The unemployment rate spiked several percentage points. So curing inflation can indeed be painful. Now we're going to move on to a discussion of the Consumer Price Index, which there's a couple ways to measure inflation. We're going to focus mainly on the CPI. So what is the CPI? Well, it measures the typical consumer's cost of living, right? Consumer Price Index. The prices for the products consumers buy. Extremely important. This is the basis of cost of living adjustments in many government entities that would say, well, you'll get a cost of living raise. That's based on the CPI. It's also Social Security. It adjusts by the inflation rate, which measured by the CPI. So pretty vitally important. So we're going to spend a fair amount of time understanding how is the CPI calculated, and you'll be calculating some examples with this. And also, what are some of the problems with the CPI? The CPI had some pretty severe problems that weren't discovered for a long time. So how is the CPI, how is it calculated? Well, first, we need to figure out what the goods are that people are buying. So call it the basket. So this is Bureau of Labor Statistics. They try to figure out what's in a typical consumer's shopping basket. They try to figure out what people are buying. On average, how many units of food, energy prices are in their housings, in their clothings, in their entertainment. There's all sorts, and we'll have a little graphic that helps show how the basket is allocated later. But this basket needs to be fixed. You hold the basket constant, and then you find the prices. You find the prices in a base year, you find the prices following year. By doing that, you could find what the inflation rate was, at least as measured by the CPI. So fix the basket, find the prices, and then it's simple multiplication, right? If the Bureau of Labor Statistics determines you buy 40 loaves of bread in a year, or the typical family or typical consumer buys 40 loaves of bread, and the cost of bread's $2, right? The bread contribution to the cost would be the 40 times $2 or $80. So you pick the basket, you figure out the prices, you multiply. That allows you to figure out the cost of the basket when you do that for every item. The base year, so some initial year where you're going to start your comparison. The base year, let's say the base year is 2000. You figure out how much all of your items cost in the base year to compute the index. Now, the CPI in the base year is always going to equal 100, whatever you choose for your base year. Why is that? Well, the CPI is calculated by this equation here. 100 times the cost of the basket in the current year divided by the cost of the basket in the base year. Well, when you're measuring for the base year, it's cost of the basket in the base year divided by cost of the basket in the base year. Same thing, obviously that has to equal 1, so the CPI equals 100. In subsequent years, it will be different. Usually it goes up, right? If prices are increasing, or if you have inflation, the CPI level is going to be increasing. In the rare years where you have deflation, then the CPI level will drop. So this is how we can calculate the CPI. The CPI then can be used to calculate the inflation rate. So from the CPI levels that you'll calculate, compute the inflation rate, and that takes the CPI That says this year versus last year, but really you could take the current period versus the previous period. If you want to figure out the inflation rate for 1999, you figure out what is the CPI in 99, CPI in 98 divided by the CPI in 98, multiply that by 100%, and that's going to give you the percentage change in prices from 98 to 99, or the inflation rate, using the CPI as our guide. So, reviewing, how do we calculate the CPI? We've got to find the basket. What products are being sold? What are the prices for those? Multiply to get the cost. You have to pick a base year. The base year, it's always going to be 100, but then you compute the CPI for the other years of interest, right? The cost of the basket in year 2 might be different than the cost of the basket in year 1, so the cost of the basket in year 2 divided by the cost of the basket in the base year times 100 is going to give you a CPI level. Computing the inflation rate, you take the difference in the CPI levels, multiply by 100%.